The neon glow of the Manhattan bar flickered across my glass, casting jagged shadows over the amber bourbon I'd been nursing for the last hour. It was a Tuesday night, well, technically Wednesday now, 2:47 a.m., and the place was alive with the low hum of laughter and clinking glasses. I'd earned this moment. The promotion I'd clawed my way toward at Gibson and Carter was finally mine, announced just hours ago over a steak dinner with the partners. The taste of victory still lingered, sharp and sweet, like the burn of the liquor on my tongue. Then my phone buzzed, slicing through the haze. I glanced down, expecting a congratulatory text from a colleague or maybe a late-night flirt from the guy I'd met at the firm's holiday party. Instead, it was her. Margaret. My mother's name glowed on the screen like a warning flare, and the message beneath it hit me like a fist to the gut. Emily, you need to come home. Atlanta. Now. Sophie's done it again. Call me. The bar's chatter faded into a dull roar as I stared at those words. Sophie. My sister. The eternal crisis magnet. I could picture her, wild-eyed, mascara-streaked, spinning some sob story about her latest disaster. And Margaret, pacing her pristine Buckhead kitchen, issuing commands like a general rallying troops for a war I never signed up for. My thumb hovered over the screen, itching to swipe the message away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But that wasn't an option. Not with them. The barstool creaked as I shifted, the leather cool against my thighs. Around me, suits and ties loosened their grips, their voices rising with the kind of reckless joy I'd felt just minutes ago. Now, it was replaced by a familiar weight pressing down on my chest, rage, hot and jagged, tangled with the resignation I'd spent years perfecting. I took a slow sip of bourbon, letting it scorch its way down, and tried to piece together what Sophie might have done this time. Another DUI? A breakup with that sleazy boyfriend she swore was the one? Or maybe she'd finally torched whatever was left of her so-called career. Whatever it was, Margaret expected me to drop everything, again, and play the family fixer. I set the glass down harder than I meant to, the thud drawing a glance from the bartender. He was a wiry guy with a sleeve of tattoos and a smirk that said he'd seen it all. Rough night, he asked, wiping down the counter. Rough family, I muttered, more to myself than to him. He chuckled, low and knowing, and moved on to pour a shot for someone else. I envied his detachment. No texts from Atlanta lighting up his phone, no ghosts from a life I'd fought to leave behind. The bar's floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city beyond, towers of glass and steel stretching into the night, their lights winking like they were in on some secret I'd never crack. I'd come to New York 3 years ago, chasing that skyline, chasing a life where I wasn't defined by Sophie's messes or Margaret's demands. Gibson and Carter had been my ticket out, a mid-tier law firm with enough prestige to impress and enough grunt work to keep me sharp. Tonight was supposed to be my coronation, proof I'd made it. And yet here I was, staring at a text that dragged me right back to the sticky heat of Georgia, to the sprawling house on Habersham Road where every room reeked of old money and older grudges. I could feel the tension coiling in my shoulders, the way it always did when Margaret's voice crept into my head. Even through text, she had a way of making every word sound like an order carved in stone. Now. That was the kicker. Not a request, not a plea, just a summons, as if I were still the obedient kid who'd jump at her call. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Or at least, I didn't want to be. The phone buzzed again, and I flinched. Another message, Emily, I mean it. Call me. This isn't negotiable. My jaw tightened. Not negotiable. That was Margaret in a nutshell, ruling the family like it was her personal courtroom, with Sophie as the perpetual defendant and me as the reluctant bailiff. I'd spent my childhood cleaning up after my sister's tantrums, her failed schemes, her endless need for rescue. And every time, Margaret's gaze would settle on me, heavy with expectation, fix it, Emily. You're the steady one, steady. That's what they called it, my ability to swallow the chaos and keep moving. But steady didn't mean unbreakable. It didn't mean I didn't feel the cracks forming, the ones I'd patched over with late nights at the firm and a stubborn refusal to look back. Tonight, those cracks were splintering wider, and I hated how easily they could pull me under. I drained the last of the bourbon, the heat of it doing little to dull the edge in my chest. The bar's clock ticked toward 3 a.m., and the crowd was thinning, couples slipping out into the humid night, a few stragglers hunched over their drinks like they had nowhere else to go. I could stay here, ride out the high of my promotion, let Margaret stew until morning. Or I could call her now, face the ultimatum I knew was coming, and decide just how much of myself I was willing to give up this time. My fingers tightened around the phone. I didn't want to do this, not tonight, not ever. But Sophie's shadow loomed too large, and Margaret's grip was too tight. I tapped the screen, the call connecting before I could talk myself out of it. The line rang once, twice, and then her voice cut through, crisp and commanding, like she'd been waiting by the phone all night. Emily, she said, no greeting, no softness. It's about time. The air in the bar felt thicker now, pressing against my skin as Margaret's voice sliced through the phone. I pressed the device harder against my ear, as if that could steady the tremor I felt building inside me. The faint hum of jazz from the speakers mingled with the clink of glasses behind me, but all I could focus on was her tone, sharp, unyielding, the kind of voice that could make a deposition sound like a death sentence. "Sophie's in trouble again," she said, skipping any pretense of small talk. "Real trouble this time. She's at the house, and I can't handle her alone. You need to get on a plane." I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the bourbon still lingering on my tongue. The bar's dim lights reflected off the polished counter, casting a warped version of my face back at me, eyes wide, lips tight, a woman caught off guard. I'd expected another lecture about Sophie's latest fling or a plea to wire money for some half-baked fix. But this sounded different. Her words carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a gravity that made my stomach twist. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, my voice low, almost drowned out by the couple laughing at a table nearby. I shifted on the stool, the leather creaking beneath me, and glanced out the window. The city pulsed beyond the glass, indifferent to the storm brewing in my head. Margaret sighed, a sound I knew too well, exasperation laced with judgment. She showed up at 2 in the morning, banging on the door, hysterical. "Said something about a fight with that boyfriend of hers, but it's more than that. She's not herself, Emily. I think she's mixed up in something bad. There's a bruise on her arm she won't explain." A bruise. The word hit me like a slap, conjuring an image of Sophie, pale, fragile Sophie, crumpling under someone's grip. My fingers tightened around the phone, nails digging into my palm. Rage flared hot and sudden, not just at whatever bastard might have touched her, but at her, too, for always dragging us back into her chaos. And at Margaret, for assuming I'd drop everything to play savior. "I just got promoted, Mom," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Tonight. I'm supposed to be celebrating, not running back to Atlanta to mop up Sophie's mess again." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in her kitchen, a sound that had haunted my childhood. When she spoke again, her voice was colder, honed to an edge that could cut through steel. "This isn't about your promotion, Emily. This is about family. You don't get to pick and choose when you're needed. I expect you here by morning." The ultimatum landed like a gavel, final and absolute. My chest tightened, a familiar mix of defiance and fear clawing its way up. I wanted to scream, to tell her I wasn't her errand girl anymore, that I'd built something here, something mine. But the words stuck, tangled in years of conditioning, in the unspoken rule that family came first, no matter the cost. I glanced around the bar again, taking in the scene I'd been savoring just minutes ago. The bartender was pouring a martini now, his movements smooth and unhurried. A woman in a red dress leaned against the jukebox, her laughter bright and careless. This was my night, my triumph, 3 years of late nights and brutal cases culminating in a corner office with my name on the door. And yet, with one call, Margaret had turned it into a bargaining chip, something I'd have to trade for Sophie's latest spiral. "Emily?" Her voice snapped me back, impatient now. "Are you there?" "Yeah," I muttered, rubbing my temple with my free hand. "I'm here." "Then say something. Are you coming or not?" The question hung between us, heavy and loaded. I could hear the creak of her pacing on the hardwood floor, the same floor I'd tiptoed across as a kid, trying to avoid her wrath. The house loomed in my mind, its high ceilings and polished mahogany, every corner steeped in power plays and whispered threats. It wasn't just a home, it was a battlefield, and Margaret was its undisputed commander. Returning meant stepping back into that war, facing not just Sophie's mess but the weight of every expectation I'd spent years running from. I closed my eyes, the bar fading into a blur of sound and shadow. Part of me wanted to hang up, to silence her voice and reclaim the night. But another part, the part that still flinched at her tone, that still saw Sophie as the little girl who'd cling to me during thunderstorms, knew I couldn't. "Not yet. I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice flat, a shield against the storm I felt brewing. "I'll call you back." "Emily, this isn't." I ended the call before she could finish, the screen going dark in my hand. My breath came fast, shallow, as I set the phone face down on the counter. The bartender glanced my way, eyebrows raised, but I waved him off. I didn't need a drink now. I needed air, space, something to drown out the echo of her words. Pushing off the stool, I grabbed my coat and stepped into the humid night. The street was alive with the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the distant wail of a siren cutting through the haze. I stood there, the city towering around me, and felt the pull of two worlds tearing at my edges, New York, with its promise of freedom, and Atlanta, with its chains of duty. My promotion felt distant now, a trophy tarnished by the choice I knew I'd have to make. I started walking, heels clicking against the sidewalk, no destination in mind. The rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was laced with something else now: fear, yes, but also a flicker of resolve. Whatever Sophie had gotten herself into, whatever Margaret demanded, I wouldn't let it swallow me whole. Not this time. The damp air clung to my skin as I walked, the city's pulse thrumming beneath my feet. My heels struck the pavement in a steady rhythm, each step a defiance against the weight of Margaret's voice still ringing in my ears. The streets of Brooklyn stretched out before me, a maze of brownstones and flickering streetlights, their shadows pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go back to the bar, couldn't sit still with that ultimatum clawing at me. My phone buzzed again in my coat pocket, but I ignored it. She'd keep calling, keep pressing, until I bent or broke. That was her way. I turned down a quieter street, the noise of Manhattan fading into a distant hum. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, a gritty perfume that grounded me, pulled me back from the edge of panic. My breath steadied, but my mind raced. Sophie's bruise. Margaret's tone. The unspoken threat beneath her words, "This isn't negotiable, star." It wasn't just about getting on a plane, it was about stepping back into a life I'd fought to escape, a life where every choice was a negotiation with someone else's demands. My promotion, my corner office, my New York, they felt like a mirage now, slipping through my fingers as Atlanta loomed closer. I stopped under a street lamp, its yellow glow casting a harsh circle around me. My hands trembled as I fished my phone out, the screen lighting up with 2 missed calls and a new text: "Emily, I'm serious. Call me back." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the call button, torn between the urge to fling the phone into the gutter and the guilt gnawing at my gut. Sophie's face flashed in my mind, those wide, pleading eyes, the way she'd always looked to me to fix what she broke. I hated her for it, hated how easily she could unravel everything I'd built. But I couldn't shake the image of that bruise, the question of who'd put it there, and why she wouldn't talk. The street was silent now, save for the faint drip of water from a nearby awning. I leaned against the lamppost, the metal cold against my back, and closed my eyes. I could still feel the high of the night, the firm's partners toasting me, the weight of their approval settling like a crown. 3 years of late nights, of clawing my way up from paralegal to associate, of proving I was more than the girl from Atlanta with a fractured family. And now, with one call, it was slipping away. Rage bubbled up again, sharp and bitter, but beneath it was something heavier: resignation, the kind that had been carved into me since I was old enough to understand what family really meant. Headlights cut through the darkness, and I squinted as a beat-up Toyota slowed beside me. The window rolled down, revealing Rachel's familiar face, my best friend, my paralegal lifeline at the firm, her dark curls spilling over the collar of her denim jacket. "Eh? What the hell are you doing out here?" she called, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. I straightened, brushing a hand through my hair. "Needed air," I said, my tone clipped. She didn't buy it, I could see it in the way her eyes narrowed, scanning me like I was a witness on the stand. "Get in," she said, jerking her head toward the passenger seat. "You look like you're about to start a fight with the sidewalk." I hesitated, then relented, sliding into the car. The interior smelled of coffee and leather, a faint trace of her lavender perfume cutting through it. She didn't drive off right away, just sat there, engine idling, waiting for me to crack. Rachel had a way of doing that, sitting in silence until the truth spilled out. We'd spent too many nights together, hunched over case files or splitting cheap wine, for me to hide much from her. "Margaret called," I said finally, staring at the dashboard. "Sophie's in some kind of mess again. Wants me back in Atlanta by morning." Rachel let out a low whistle, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. "And let me guess, you're supposed to drop everything and play superhero?" "Something like that," I muttered, sinking lower in the seat. She didn't give details, just enough to make it sound bad. A bruise on Sophie's arm, some fight with her boyfriend. Mom's acting like it's life or death. She glanced at me, her expression softening. "You don't have to go, you know. You've got a life here." "That promotion, I know," I snapped, then softened. "I know. But it's not that simple. It never is with them." The car fell silent, the hum of the engine filling the space. Rachel shifted, reaching into the center console and pulling out a pack of gum. She offered me a piece, and I took it, the mint sharp against my tongue. "So what's the plan?" she asked, popping a piece into her own mouth. "You gonna call her back and tell her to shove it, or are you already mentally packing a suitcase?" I didn't answer right away. My fingers twisted the gum wrapper into a tight spiral, the metallic crinkle loud in the quiet. I wanted to tell Margaret no, to dig in my heels and protect the life I'd carved out here. But the fear was there, too, a cold thread winding through me. What if Sophie was really in danger? What if I stayed, and something happened, something I could have stopped? The thought lodged in my chest, heavy and unmovable. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I told her I'd think about it. She's not gonna let it go, though. She'll keep calling until I cave." Rachel snorted. Sounds like Margaret. Queen of the guilt trip. I managed a weak smile, but it faded fast. The dashboard clock glowed 3:42 a.m., the numbers ticking closer to dawn. My celebration felt like a lifetime ago, the taste of bourbon and victory replaced by the bitter sting of indecision. I leaned my head against the window, the glass cool against my temple, and watched the street lamp's light fracture in the mist. Drive, I said suddenly, sitting up. Anywhere. I need to think. Rachel didn't argue. She shifted the car into gear, and we rolled forward, the city sliding past in a blur of shadow and neon. The streets were emptier now, the night thinning toward morning, and I let my mind drift. I pictured Margaret in her kitchen, pacing past the marble island, her silk robe trailing behind her like a royal train. The house on Habersham Road rose up in my memory, its wide staircase, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the halls, the conference room where Dad used to broker deals before he walked out. It was a place of power, of unspoken rules, and I'd always been the one to enforce them when Sophie couldn't, or wouldn't. The car turned onto a bridge, the East River glittering below, and I felt the first stirrings of defiance harden into something real. I couldn't keep doing this, running back every time they snapped their fingers, sacrificing my own life for theirs. But walking away wasn't simple either. Revenge wasn't the word for it, not yet, but there was a part of me that wanted them to feel the cost of what they asked, to see me as more than the family's safety net. Pull over, I said as we reached the other side. Rachel shot me a look but complied, easing the car to the curb. Dawn was breaking now, a faint gray light seeping into the sky, and I dug into my bag, pulling out my laptop. My fingers hesitated over the keys, then began to type. Dear Margaret, I started, the words spilling out fast and jagged. I'm not coming back. Not this time. Sophie's your daughter too, deal with her. I've got my own life here, and I'm not letting you take it from me again. I paused, my breath catching. The letter wasn't finished, not yet, but it was a start. A line in the sand. Rachel leaned over, reading over my shoulder, and let out a quiet, damn, It's not done, I said, my voice steadier now. But it's something. She nodded, a grin tugging at her lips. It's a hell of a something. The sky lightened, the city waking around us, and I kept typing, the words pouring out like a confession. Each keystroke felt like a rebellion, a shedding of the weight I'd carried too long. But even as I wrote, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. Margaret wouldn't let go without a fight, and Sophie's shadow would linger, bruise and all. The conflict was just beginning, and I was only starting to see how deep it ran. The dawn light crept through the windshield, painting the dashboard in shades of gray as I sat hunched over my laptop, the cursor blinking at the end of my unfinished letter. Rachel's Toyota idled at the curb, the engine's soft rumble a steady pulse beneath the chaos in my head. The East River stretched out beyond the bridge, its surface rippling under the first streaks of morning, cold and indifferent. My fingers hovered over the keys, the weight of what I'd written pressing against my ribs, I'm not coming back. Not this time. The words stared back at me, raw and unpolished, a declaration I wasn't sure I could stand by. But they were mine, and that was enough for now. Rachel shifted beside me, her elbow propped on the steering wheel, her silence louder than any question. She didn't push, didn't pry, just watched as I wrestled with the next line. The air in the car was thick with the scent of coffee and mint gum, a lifeline to the present while my mind spun back to Atlanta, to the house on Habersham Road with its towering columns and suffocating expectations. I could see Margaret's face if she read this, her lips thinning into that tight, controlled line, her eyes narrowing with the kind of disapproval that could strip you bare. And Sophie, Sophie, crumpled in some corner, waiting for me to swoop in and stitch her life back together. I typed again, the clack of the keys sharp in the quiet. You've always said I'm the steady one, but I'm tired of carrying that weight. I've got a promotion, a life here, and I'm not trading it for another round of Sophie's drama. My breath hitched, a mix of guilt and defiance twisting in my gut. The letter wasn't just a refusal, it was a severing, a blade cutting through years of tangled loyalty. I didn't know if I meant it yet, not fully, but the act of writing it felt like peeling off a skin I'd outgrown. Rachel said, her voice soft but firm, pulling me back. You okay? I glanced at her, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in her dark eyes. I don't know, I admitted, shutting the lid with a quiet snap. But I'm not calling her back. Not yet. She nodded, a flicker of pride crossing her face. Good. She doesn't own you, you know. I wanted to believe that. I leaned back in the seat, the leather creaking under me, and stared out at the river. The city was waking up, delivery trucks rumbling past, a jogger darting along the waterfront, the skyline sharpening against the pale sky. New York didn't care about my family's messes, didn't bend to Margaret's commands. That's why I'd come here, why I'd fought so hard to stay. But the pull of Atlanta was still there, a tether I couldn't quite snap. Let's go home, I said finally, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I need coffee. And a shower. And maybe a plan. Rachel grinned, shifting the car into gear. Now you're talking. My place or yours? Mine, I said. I need my own space to figure this out. The drive back to Brooklyn was quiet, the streets unfolding in a blur of brick and steel. My apartment waited on the 4th floor of a walk-up in Carroll Gardens, a cramped one-bedroom with peeling paint and a view of the neighbor's fire escape. It wasn't much, but it was mine, paid for with late nights at Gibson and Carter and a stubborn refusal to lean on anyone else. As Rachel pulled up to the curb, I grabbed my bag and stepped out, the morning air sharp against my skin. Call me if you need me, she said through the open window. And don't let her guilt trip you into anything. I won't, I lied, offering a weak smile as she drove off. The street was still, the brownstones looming like sentinels, their windows dark and unseeing. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, and fumbled with my keys at the door. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of lavender from a candle I'd left burning too long, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound. I dropped my bag on the couch and kicked off my heels, the hardwood cool under my feet. The letter still burned in my mind, unfinished but alive, a spark I couldn't smother. I crossed to the kitchenette, flicking on the coffee maker, and leaned against the counter as it gurgled to life. My phone sat on the table, silent now, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. Margaret would call again, probably before the sun was fully up, and I'd have to decide whether to answer. Whether to stand by the words I'd typed in the heat of the night. A knock at the door jolted me upright, the sound sharp and unexpected. My pulse spiked, an irrational fear flashing through me, Margaret, here, dragging me back herself. But that was impossible. I crossed the room, peering through the peephole, and froze. Sophie stood on the other side, her blonde hair tangled, her coat hanging loose over her thin frame. Her face was pale, shadowed with exhaustion, and a dark bruise bloomed along her forearm, stark against her skin. It's me, she called, her voice muffled but urgent. Please, let me in. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, every instinct screaming to turn her away. The letter's words echoed in my head, I'm not trading it for another round of Sophie's drama. But here she was, flesh and blood, not just a name on a screen. The bruise stared back at me through the peephole, a silent accusation, and guilt clawed at my resolve. Damn it, I muttered, unlatching the door and pulling it open. She stumbled inside, her eyes red-rimmed and wild, and dropped a duffel bag at her feet. The air shifted with her presence, tense, heavy, like the room couldn't hold us both. Sophie, what the hell? I snapped, shutting the door behind her. What are you doing here? She didn't answer right away, just sank onto my couch, her hands trembling as she hugged her arms around herself. The bruise looked worse up close, purple and angry, the edges blurring into her skin. My stomach turned, rage and fear tangling together, but I held my ground, arms crossed. I couldn't stay there, she said finally, her voice small, cracked. Mom's losing it, and I didn't know where else to go. What happened? I demanded, stepping closer. That bruise, who did that? She flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor. It's nothing. Just a fight. I'm fine. You're not fine, I shot back, my voice rising. You show up at my door I glanced at the clock, 5 a.m, looking like hell, with a mark like that, and you expect me to believe it's nothing? She shrank into the couch, her shoulders hunching, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, scared, lost, needing me to step in. But I wasn't that sister anymore. I couldn't be. Not after last night, not after the letter. Sophie, talk to me, I said, softer now, though the edge in my voice lingered. What's going on? She took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting in her lap. It's Jake, she whispered. My boyfriend. Ex-boyfriend, I guess. We got into it last night, really bad. He grabbed me, and I ran. Mom found me at the house, freaked out, and told me to call you. But I couldn't wait. I took a bus up here instead. Jake. The name landed like a stone, heavy and cold. I'd met him once, tall, slick, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'd hated him on sight, but Sophie had sworn he was different. Now here she was, bruised and broken, proving me right in the worst way. Why didn't you call? I asked, my throat tight. Why just show up like this? I didn't think you'd answer, she said, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were wide, pleading, and something in me cracked. Mom said you were done with us. That you wouldn't come? I froze, Margaret's voice echoing in my head, this isn't negotiable. She'd already written me off, told Sophie I'd abandoned them. The realization stung, but it also sharpened something inside me, a resolve I hadn't felt until now. I almost was, I admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. I was going to write her a letter, tell her I'm out. Done cleaning up your messes. Sophie's face crumpled, tears spilling over. I'm sorry, Em. I didn't mean for this, I didn't want. Stop, I cut her off, my voice hard. I don't need apologies. I need you to tell me what you want. Because I can't keep doing this, running back every time you fall apart. I've got a life here, Sophie. A good one. And I'm not letting it go. She nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I don't want you to fix me. I need somewhere to stay. Just for a little while. I'll figure it out, I swear. I studied her, the bruise glaring under the dim light of my lamp. The coffee maker beeped in the kitchen, a mundane sound against the weight of her words. Part of me wanted to shove her out the door, to finish that letter and book a one-way ticket to anywhere but here. But another part, the part that still remembered her hiding under my bed during storms, couldn't turn away. Fine, I said, standing. You can stay. But this isn't a free pass. You figure your shit out, and you don't drag me into it. Deal? Deal, she whispered, relief flooding her face. I turned away, heading for the kitchen to pour the coffee, my hands shaking as I gripped the mug. The letter sat unfinished on my laptop, a promise I'd almost kept. But now, with Sophie on my couch and Margaret's shadow looming, I knew this was only the beginning. I pulled out my phone, opened a booking app, and stared at the flights to New York, round trip, not one way. I wasn't cutting ties yet, but I wasn't bending either. Not anymore. The coffee scalded my tongue as I took a sip, the bitter heat grounding me as I stood in the kitchenette, staring at Sophie slumped on my couch. Her duffel bag sat like a silent intruder at her feet, its worn canvas edges fraying under the weight of whatever chaos she'd packed inside. The bruise on her arm glared up at me, a purple stain against the pale morning light filtering through the blinds. I'd let her in, against every instinct, against the letter still burning unfinished on my laptop, but the air between us crackled with tension, a tightrope stretched thin over years of resentment. I set the mug down on the counter, the ceramic clinking against the chipped formica, and rubbed my temples. The clock on the wall ticked past 5:30 a.m., each second a reminder of the life I'd been clinging to just hours ago, my promotion, my corner office, my New York. Now, Sophie's presence threatened to unravel it all, her quiet sobs pulling at threads I'd spent years stitching together. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she couldn't just stop, why I had to be the one to catch her every time she fell. But the words lodged in my throat, choked by the guilt I couldn't shake. Her voice was small, fragile, cutting through the hum of the fridge. She'd shifted on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes wide and searching. I lost my job. I froze, my hand halfway to the coffee pot again. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unexpected, like a stone dropped into still water. I turned slowly, leaning against the counter, arms crossed tight across my chest. What do you mean, you lost your job? She swallowed, her fingers twisting the hem of her coat. The boutique. They let me go yesterday. Said I wasn't reliable anymore. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away, staring at the floor like it held some answer I couldn't see. I tried, Em. I swear I did. But after Jake, after everything, I couldn't focus. I kept messing up, showing up late, forgetting orders. They didn't care why. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as her words sank deep. Sophie's job at that overpriced Buckhead boutique had been her lifeline, her one fragile claim to independence, the thing she'd clung to whenever Margaret or I pushed her to get her act together. Losing it wasn't just a paycheck gone, it was another piece of her crumbling, another mess I'd have to navigate. My jaw tightened, a familiar mix of pity and frustration coiling in my gut. So you lost your job, fought with Jake, and decided to haul ass to Brooklyn? I said, my tone sharper than I meant it to be. What's the plan, Sophie? Crash here until you figure out the next disaster? She flinched, her shoulders hunching further, and for a moment, I regretted it. But only for a moment. I'd spent too long softening my edges for her, too long pretending her choices didn't cut me too. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, the bruise shifting under the motion, and met my gaze. I didn't have anywhere else, she whispered. Mom's a wreck, she's all over me about Jake, about the job, about everything. I couldn't breathe there, Em. I needed you. Her words hit like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. I needed you. How many times had I heard that? How many times had I let it pull me back into their orbit, Marge's commands, Sophie's pleas, the endless cycle of fixing what they broke? I wanted to tell her no, to shove her out the door and lock it behind her, to finish that letter and mean every word. But the bruise stared back at me, a silent plea of its own, and my resolve wavered. Sophie, I started, my voice low, controlled, I told you, you can stay. But this isn't me signing up to fix you again. You've got to figure this out. I've got my own life here, and I'm not. My phone buzzed on the table, cutting me off. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected, Daniel Carter. My boss. One of the founding partners at Gibson and Carter. My stomach dropped, a cold dread pooling there as I snatched the phone up. It was barely dawn. Partners didn't call this early unless something was wrong. Hold that thought, I muttered to Sophie, stepping toward the window as I answered. Daniel? Everything okay? Emily, his voice came through, clipped and tense, the kind of tone he used in boardroom showdowns. I need you in the office. Now. We've got a situation. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, the Brooklyn street blurring below me. What kind of situation? I just left the dinner a few hours ago. It's Henry, he cut in, and my heart stuttered. Henry Gibson. The other half of the firm. My mentor. The gruff, chain-smoking bastard who'd taken a chance on me when I was just a paralegal with a chip on my shoulder. He had a heart attack last night. He's in the ICU. We're scrambling here, clients are spooked, and the Paris deal's on the brink. The world tilted, the room spinning as his words sank in. Henry, larger than life, always barking orders through a haze of cigarette smoke, was down. Paris. The merger we'd been hammering out for months, the one that had sealed my promotion. I could hear the strain in Daniel's voice, the barely contained panic of a man watching his empire teeter. Is he going to be okay? I managed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. We don't know yet, Daniel said. He's stable, but it's bad. Look, I hate to do this to you after last night, but I need you here. We're sending someone to Paris to hold the reins, might be you, if you're up for it. Can you be at the office in an hour? I glanced back at Sophie, her wide eyes locked on me, sensing the shift. An hour. My apartment was a mess, my sister was a wreck, and I hadn't slept. But Paris was a lifeline, a chance to claw my way out of this trap closing around me. And Henry? I owed him. More than I could ever repay. Yeah, I said, straightening. I'll be there. Good, Daniel said, relief edging into his tone. See you soon. The call ended, and I stood there, the phone warm against my palm, my mind racing. Sophie's confession, Henry's collapse, it was too much, piling up like debris after a storm. I turned back to her, her face pale and expectant, and felt a surge of determination harden inside me. Get up, I said, crossing to the couch. You're coming with me. What? She blinked, confusion creasing her brow. I've got to go to the office. Something's happened, Henry, my boss, he's sick. I can't leave you here alone, not like this. So grab your shit and let's go. She hesitated, then nodded, scrambling to her feet and slinging the duffel over her shoulder. I grabbed my coat and laptop, the letter to Margaret flashing in my mind, unfinished, unresolved. But there was no time for that now. The stakes had shifted, and I was being pulled in every direction, family, work, the past I couldn't outrun. The cab ride to Gibson and Carter was a blur of honking horns and gray streets, Sophie silent beside me, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I stared out the window, the Manhattan skyline looming closer, its jagged edges a mirror to the tension coiling inside me. By the time we reached the firm's tower on 6th Avenue, the sun was up, casting long shadows across the glass facade. I paid the driver and marched inside, Sophie trailing behind like a lost shadow. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist's desk empty this early, but the elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. When the door slid open, the office was already alive, phones ringing, associates darting between cubicles, a low hum of controlled chaos. Daniel's corner office loomed at the far end, its glass walls revealing a scene straight out of a war room, him pacing, tie loosened, barking into a headset while papers littered his desk. Emily, he called as I approached, waving me in. His eyes flicked to Sophie, a brief flicker of surprise, but he didn't comment. Close the door. I nudged Sophie toward a chair in the corner and shut the glass panel behind me. The office smelled of stale coffee and ink, the city sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a dizzying drop to the streets below. Daniel's desk was a fortress of files and laptops, a stark contrast to the sleek leather chairs and polished wood I'd admired during my promotion dinner. Now, it felt like a battlefield, and I was stepping into the fray. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I obeyed, my spine stiff, as he sank into his own seat, rubbing his temples. Henry's out of surgery, but he's not waking up yet. Doctors say it's touch and go. The Paris deal's teetering, clients want assurances, and we're bleeding credibility every hour he's down. I nodded, my throat tight. What do you need from me? He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his gaze piercing. I need you in Paris. Tomorrow, if we can swing it. The merger's too big to lose, Gibson and Carter's name is on the line, and you're the one who knows the file inside out. But I need to know you're all in. No distractions. His eyes darted to Sophie again, a question he didn't voice. I followed his glance, saw her hunched in the corner, staring at her hands like they held some secret. My chest tightened, guilt, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Resolve. I couldn't fix her, couldn't fix Henry, but I could hold this together. I had to. I'm in, I said, meeting his gaze. Paris, the deal, all of it. I can handle it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over his features. Good. We'll get you on a flight tomorrow night. In the meantime, I need you to brief the team, calm the clients. Can you do that? Yeah, I said, my voice steadier now. I've got it. He exhaled, leaning back. All right. Get to work. And Emily, he paused, his tone softening just a fraction. Henry believed in you. Don't let him down. The words landed heavy, a weight I couldn't shrug off. I stood, smoothing my coat, and turned to Sophie. Stay here, I told her, my voice firm. Don't touch anything. I'll figure out what to do with you later. She nodded, mute, and I stepped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind me. The bullpen buzzed around me, associates shouting into phones, printers whirring, a frantic rhythm I knew too well. But as I moved toward my new corner office, the one I'd barely had time to claim, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Henry's heart attack, Sophie's collapse, the Paris deal, it was all colliding, a storm I couldn't outrun. And somewhere, deep down, I knew Margaret was still waiting, her silence louder than any call. I pushed open my office door, the space stark and untouched, empty bookshelves, a desk still smelling of fresh lacquer. The view stretched across Midtown, a sea of glass and steel, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. Shock still lingered, sharp and cold, but beneath it was something new, tentative hope, a flicker of purpose. Paris was a chance, a lifeline out of this mess. But Sophie's bruise, Henry's fight, they tethered me here too. I sank into the chair, my hands trembling as I opened my laptop, and started typing, not the letter this time, but a battle plan. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across my new office as I hunched over my laptop, fingers flying across the keys. The battle plan took shape, a briefing for the team, a list of Paris clients to call, a script to steady their nerves. Each word felt like a brick, stacking up a wall between me and the chaos threatening to swallow me whole. Outside, the Midtown skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a jagged silhouette against the late morning sky. But the view couldn't shake the weight pressing down on me, Henry's heart attack, Sophie's bruise, the Paris deal teetering on the edge. My hands shook slightly as I typed, adrenaline and exhaustion warring in my veins. The door creaked open behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know it was Sophie. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the bullpen beyond the glass. I kept my eyes on the screen, unwilling to let her pull me off course, not now, when everything was fraying at the seams. She said, her voice thin, trembling like a thread about to snap. I need to talk to you. Not now, Sophie, I snapped, sharper than I intended. My fingers paused over the keys, the cursor blinking accusingly. I've got a firm falling apart and a plane to catch tomorrow. Whatever it is, it can wait. She didn't move. I could feel her standing there, a shadow in my peripheral vision, her presence a quiet insistence I couldn't ignore. The air thickened with her silence, and irritation flared hot in my chest. I spun the chair around, meeting her gaze, those wide, pleading eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, the bruise on her arm stark against the sleeve of her borrowed sweater. It can't wait, she said, her voice breaking. I just got a call from Atlanta. It's Dad. My breath caught, a cold jolt slicing through me. Henry, Dad, his name tangled in my mind with the man lying in an ICU bed 3 blocks away. What about him? I asked, my tone flat, a shield against the dread creeping up my spine. He's awake, she said, stepping closer, her hands twisting together. But it's not good. The doctor said the heart attack did damage, serious damage. They don't know if he'll, she trailed off, swallowing hard, tears spilling over. They don't know if he'll make it through the week. The room tilted, the edges blurring as her words sank in. Henry Gibson, the gruff bastard who'd taught me how to stare down a boardroom, who'd handed me my first real case with a grunt and a cigarette-stained smirk, he was slipping away. My mentor, my anchor at the firm, the closest thing I'd had to a father since ours walked out. I pressed my palms against the desk, the cool wood grounding me as shock gave way to a hollow ache. When did they call? I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. 10 minutes ago, she said, wiping her face with her sleeve. I was in Daniel's office, waiting like you told me. Mom was on the line too, she's at the hospital now. She said you need to come back. Tonight. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed in the small space. Of course she did. Always the same damn play, snap her fingers, and I'm supposed to run. I stood, pacing to the window, my reflection a ghost against the glass. The city sprawled below, indifferent, its pulse steady while mine raced. I can't, Sophie. I'm flying to Paris tomorrow. The merger's hanging by a thread, and Daniel's counting on me. Henry's counting on me. He's dying, she whispered, and the words hit like a fist, knocking the air from my lungs. You can't just stay here. I turned, glaring at her, anger surging to mask the guilt clawing at me. Don't tell me what I can't do. You don't get to show up here, bruised and jobless, and guilt me into fixing this too. I'm not your safety net anymore, I told you that. Her face crumpled, but she didn't back down. This isn't about me. It's about him. He's asking for you. Mom said he woke up and kept saying your name, Emily. Where's Emily? You're the one he wants, not me. The air went still, her words hanging between us like smoke. Henry asking for me. Not Sophie, not Margaret, but me, the kid he'd plucked from the paralegal pool and molded into something sharper, something he could be proud of. My throat tightened, a tangle of pride and despair twisting inside me. I wanted to believe it was delirium, a fluke, but I could hear his voice in my head, gravelly, impatient, barking my name across the office when I'd miss a deadline. He believed in me, bet on me, and now he was fading, reaching out across the miles. I can't, I said again, softer this time, more to myself than to her. I sank back into the chair, my hands gripping the armrests. Paris is tomorrow. If I leave now, the deal collapses. The firm collapses. Everything I've built, everything you've built? Sophie cut in, her voice rising, sharp with an edge I hadn't heard before. What about what he built? What about what he gave you? You're sitting in this office because of him, Em. And now you're just gonna let him die alone? Stop it, I snapped, slamming my hand on the desk. The laptop jolted, the screen flickering. You don't get to lecture me. You don't get to waltz in here and turn this into my fault. I didn't ask for this, any of it. Not your mess, not Mom's demands, not Henry's. My voice broke, and I hated it, hated the crack that let her see how deep this cut. She stepped closer, her shoes scuffing the carpet, and dropped to her knees beside me. I'm not trying to make it your fault, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I'm scared, Em. I don't know what to do. Mom's falling apart, Henry's dying, and I'm useless. But you're not. You never have been. That's why he wants you there. I stared at her, the bruise on her arm a silent scream in the corner of my vision. Useless. The word stung, not because she said it, but because I'd thought it too, about her, about myself when I couldn't fix everything. My anger faltered, giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. I wanted to shove her away, to lock the door and bury myself in the Paris file until the world stopped spinning. But her eyes held mine, pleading, and I felt the fight draining out of me. I can't go tonight, I said finally, my voice low, measured. But I'll call the hospital. I'll talk to him, if he can talk. And I'll figure out Paris. Maybe I can delay the flight, rework the schedule. But Sophie, I leaned forward, locking eyes with her, you've got to step up too. I can't carry this alone. She nodded, tears streaking her face, but there was something new in her expression, resolve, fragile but real. I will, she said. I promise. I didn't fully believe her, not yet, but it was enough for now. I reached for my phone, dialing the hospital's ICU line with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The nurse picked up, her voice calm and clipped, and confirmed Henry was awake, weak but lucid. When she patched me through, the line crackled, and then his voice came through, faint, raspy, but unmistakably him. Emily, he said, each syllable a struggle. That you? Yeah, Henry, I said, my throat tight, tears burning behind my eyes. It's me. Good, he rasped, a faint chuckle breaking through. Thought you'd run off to Paris already. Don't let these bastards screw up my deal, you hear? I laughed, a choked sound, and pressed my hand to my mouth. I won't. Promise. There was a pause, his breathing labored, and then, proud of you, kid. Always was. The line went quiet, the nurse cutting in to say he needed rest. I hung up, the phone slipping into my lap, and stared at the wall, Henry's words echoing in my skull. Proud of me. It was a lifeline, a thread to hold on to, but it couldn't erase the dread pooling in my gut. He was slipping away, and I was still here, tethered to a desk and a sister I couldn't trust to stand on her own. Sophie watched me, silent now, her hands clasped tight. The office felt smaller, the walls closing in, the hum of the bullpen a distant roar. I stood, crossing to the window again, and pressed my forehead against the glass. The city stared back, cold and unyielding, a mirror to the pressure crushing me from every side, Henry's fight, Sophie's need, the Paris deal, Margaret's looming shadow. Get your coat, I said without turning. We're going to the hospital. Tonight. But Paris, she started, confusion lacing her voice. I'll handle it, I cut her off, my tone final. I'll call Daniel, push the flight. Henry deserves that much. I didn't look at her as I grabbed my bag, the weight of my choice settling like lead in my chest. Guilt gnawed at me, guilt for delaying Paris, for not being there sooner, for the relief I felt at hearing Henry's voice. But beneath it, determination burned, a quiet fire stoked by his pride, by the need to prove I could hold this together. Sophie followed me out, her steps quick and uncertain, and we stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft thud. The ride down was silent, the air thick with everything unsaid. When we hit the street, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across 6th Avenue, the wind biting at my skin. We hailed a cab, the hospital only minutes away, but each second stretched taut, a countdown to a confrontation I wasn't ready for. Henry's bedside loomed in my mind, not the sterile room itself, but the power it held, the ghosts of family and firm colliding in a space I couldn't control. The cab pulled up to Lenox Hill, its brick facade stark against the sky. I paid and stepped out, Sophie trailing behind, her duffel slung over her shoulder. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and fear, the kind that seeps into your bones. At the ICU desk, the nurse waved us through, her eyes lingering on Sophie's bruise with a flicker of concern she didn't voice. Henry's room was at the end of the hall, the door half open, machines beeping a steady rhythm. Margaret stood by the window, her silk blouse pristine despite the hours she'd spent here, her posture rigid as if she could command death itself to back off. She turned as we entered, her gaze locking on me, sharp, assessing, a general sizing up her troops. "You're late," she said, her voice low but cutting. "He's been asking for you." I ignored her, my eyes on Henry. He lay propped against pillows, his skin gray, tubes snaking from his arms. His chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven, but his eyes, those sharp, hawk-like eyes, found mine, a faint spark still there. "Kid," he croaked, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Took you long enough?" I crossed to his side, my throat tight, and took his hand, cool, frail, a stark contrast to the iron grip I remembered. "Had to make sure the firm didn't burn down without you," I said, forcing a smile. He chuckled, a weak, wheezing sound, and squeezed my hand. "Good girl." Margaret stepped closer, her shadow falling across us. "Emily, we need to talk." "The business," Sophie's stepping in. "She's taking over." I froze, my head snapping up to meet her gaze, then darting to Sophie. She stood by the door, her coat swapped for a blazer I hadn't noticed before, her posture straighter, her eyes wide but steady. Business attire. At Henry's bedside. The pieces clicked, Margaret's plan, Sophie's promise to step up, a power play I hadn't seen coming. "What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising, the room shrinking around me. The antiseptic sting of the hospital room burned my nostrils as I stood frozen, Henry's frail hand still clasped in mine. His faint chuckle lingered in the air, a fragile thread tying me to him, but Margaret's words, Sophie stepping in. "She's taking over, cut through it like a blade." My eyes darted between them, Margaret, rigid as steel by the window, her silk blouse catching the dim light like armor, and Sophie, hovering near the door in that blazer, too crisp, too deliberate, her bruised arm barely hidden beneath the sleeve. The room shrank, the beeping machines and sterile walls pressing in, amplifying the thud of my pulse against my skull. "What the hell are you talking about?" I repeated, my voice climbing, raw and jagged. I dropped Henry's hand, gently, despite the storm raging inside me, and turned fully to face Margaret. Her gaze met mine, cool and unyielding, the same look she'd worn when she'd ordered me back to Atlanta at 2:47 a.m. But this wasn't just a summons. This was a coup. "Exactly what I said," she replied, her tone clipped, each word precise as a gavel strike. "Henry's business, Gibson and Carter's Atlanta branch, needs leadership. He's in no state to run it, and Sophie's ready. She's been training for this." "Training?" I spat, incredulity twisting my voice into something sharp enough to cut. I glanced at Sophie, her posture stiff but her eyes flickering with something. Guilt? Pride? She lost her job at a boutique yesterday, showed up at my apartment with a bruise and a sob story, and now you're telling me she's ready to run a law firm? Sophie flinched, her fingers tightening around the strap of her duffel, still slung over her shoulder like a lifeline. She started, but Margaret cut her off with a raised hand, a gesture so practiced it silenced the room. "She's been working with Henry's team for weeks," Margaret said, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the tile with deliberate menace. "Discreetly. Learning the ropes. He saw potential in her, said she had grit, if she'd just focus. And now, with him like this," she gestured toward Henry, his chest rising and falling unevenly under the thin hospital blanket, "she's stepping up." I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that ricocheted off the walls. "Grit? Sophie? The same Sophie who couldn't hold a retail job because she was too busy fighting with her deadbeat boyfriend." My eyes locked on my sister, daring her to contradict me. "When were you going to tell me about this little apprenticeship? Before or after you crashed on my couch?" Her mouth opened, then closed, her gaze dropping to the floor. The blazer, Henry's blazer, I realized now, the faint scent of his cigarettes clinging to it, hung on her like a costume, too big for the trembling girl beneath. But there was something in her stance, a quiet steel I hadn't seen before, and it unnerved me more than Margaret's words. Emily, Henry's voice rasped from the bed, weak but insistent, pulling my attention back. His eyes were half open, glassy with pain but sharp enough to pin me in place. Stop, tearing into her. She's trying. I turned to him, my chest tightening at the sight, his gray skin, the tubes snaking from his arms, the man who'd built an empire reduced to a whisper. Trying? I echoed, softer now, the fight leaching out of me as I met his gaze. Henry, she's not ready. You know that. This isn't some boutique counter, this is your legacy. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made me wince, and lifted a trembling hand to wave me off. My legacy's bigger than me now. Sophie's got something. Seen it. He paused, his breath shallow. You've got the brains, the fire. But she's got heart. Needs a chance. His words landed like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. Heart. The thing I'd buried under late nights in case files, the thing I'd told myself I didn't need to survive Margaret's world or Sophie's chaos. I looked at her again, really looked, past the bruise, past the tears, and saw it, a flicker of determination, fragile but real, mirrored in the way she straightened under my glare. Henry, I started, but Margaret stepped between us, her shadow falling across the bed like a curtain. Enough, she said, her voice low, commanding. This isn't a debate. The decision's made. Sophie's taking over Atlanta, and you're needed in Paris. The merger's your fight now, Henry's counting on you there. We're not losing both branches because you're too stubborn to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture. Her favorite refrain, the one she drilled into me since I was a kid, family first, duty above all. But this wasn't duty, this was a power grab, a chess move with Sophie as the pawn and me as the knight sent to the front lines. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms, and stared past her at the window. The Atlanta skyline loomed beyond, steel and glass rising from the haze, a city of old money and new ambition. Henry's office was out there, a corner suite in the Peachtree Tower, its mahogany desk and leather chairs a throne I'd once dreamed of claiming. Now, Sophie was stepping into it, and I was being shipped off to fight a war I hadn't started. Paris, I said finally, the word tasting like ash. You're sending me to Paris while she plays dress up in your office? I jerked my head toward Sophie, my voice rising again despite Henry's labored breathing. What happens when she screws it up, Henry? When the clients walk because she can't handle the pressure? She won't, Margaret snapped, her eyes narrowing. Because you'll be there to guide her. From Paris, from New York, wherever you are. You're still part of this, Emily. You don't get to walk away. I stared at her, the room tilting under the weight of her words. Part of this. Trapped, no matter how far I ran, New York, Paris, it didn't matter. The family, the firm, they'd always pull me back. My gaze shifted to Sophie, her lips pressed tight, her hands trembling but her chin lifted. She wasn't arguing, wasn't crumbling. She was accepting it, stepping into the fire I'd spent years dodging. Emily, Henry rasped again, his voice barely audible over the machines. Trust her. Trust me. Trust. The word hung there, heavy and impossible. I wanted to scream that I didn't, that I couldn't trust Sophie to tie her own shoes, let alone run a law firm. But Henry's eyes held mine, pleading, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. He wasn't just asking me to let her try, he was asking me to let go, of the control I'd clung to, the resentment I'd nursed, the life I'd built to prove I didn't need them. I sank into the chair beside his bed, my legs giving out as the fight drained from me. The room smelled of bleach and desperation, the air thick with the weight of too many choices colliding. Sophie stepped closer, her shadow falling across me, and I looked up at her, really looked. The blazer dwarfed her, but her eyes were steady, a quiet resolve I hadn't expected. Maybe Henry was right. Maybe she had something I'd missed, buried under the chaos. Fine, I said, my voice low, cracked. She takes Atlanta. I'll handle Paris. But Sophie, I locked eyes with her, my tone hardening, you screw this up, and it's on you. Not me. Not anymore. She nodded, a single, sharp motion, her jaw tight. I won't. I swear. Margaret exhaled, a sound of triumph masked as relief, and turned back to the window, her silhouette framed against the city. Good. It's settled. Emily, your flight's tomorrow night, Daniel's already briefed. Sophie, you'll meet with Henry's team in the morning. They're expecting you. The room fell silent, save for Henry's ragged breathing and the steady beep of the monitor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and stared at the floor, scuffed tile, a map of countless footsteps before mine. My chest ached, a tangle of fury and surrender twisting inside me. Paris loomed ahead, a battlefield of its own, but here, in this sterile box, the real war was unfolding, a family fractured, a legacy split, and me caught in the crossfire. I stood, smoothing my coat, and crossed to Henry's side again. His eyes were closed now, his chest rising slower, but I leaned down, my voice a whisper. I'll save the merger, Henry. For you. But she'd better be worth it. His lips twitched, a faint smile, but he didn't answer. I straightened, glancing at Sophie one last time, her blazer, her bruise, her newfound steel, and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. The hallway stretched long and empty, the antiseptic air cold against my skin, and I kept moving, my heels echoing like gunfire. Margaret's plan, Sophie's rise, it was done, a deal sealed in blood and ink. But as I stepped into the elevator, the weight of Henry's trust settled over me, a burden and a lifeline all at once. The cab ride back to my hotel was a blur of headlights and horns, Atlanta's streets alive with the hum of dusk. My phone buzzed, Daniel, confirming the Paris flight, but I silenced it, staring out at the city I'd fled and now couldn't escape. Tomorrow, I'd board that plane, fight for the merger, prove Henry's faith wasn't misplaced. But tonight, in the quiet of my room, I'd face the truth, this wasn't just about business. It was personal, a reckoning with the sister I'd resented, the mother I'd defied, and the mentor I couldn't lose. The cab's tires hissed against the wet Atlanta pavement as I leaned my head against the window, the city's lights smearing into streaks of gold and red through the rain-streaked glass. My hotel loomed ahead, a squat brick building dwarfed by the Peachtree Tower's glowing spire in the distance, Henry's domain, now Sophie's, or so Margaret had decreed. The driver muttered something about the weather, but I barely heard him, my mind still tangled in the hospital room's antiseptic haze, Henry's fading grip, Sophie's trembling resolve, Margaret's unshakable command. My phone buzzed again in my lap, Daniel's name flashing, but I let it go to voicemail, too drained to face another battle tonight. The cab jolted to a stop, and I paid with a crumpled 20, stepping out into the drizzle. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and magnolia blossoms, a perfume that clung to Atlanta like a memory I couldn't shake. My heels clicked against the lobby's marble floor as I crossed to the elevator, the silence pressing in, broken only by the faint hum of music overhead. Upstairs, my room was a sterile box, beige walls, a bed too stiff to feel like home, a window framing the city's restless pulse. I dropped my bag on the dresser and sank onto the mattress, kicking off my shoes with a sigh that felt like surrender. Henry's voice echoed in my skull, proud of you, kid. Always was. It should have been a comfort, a tether to hold on to, but it landed like a weight, pulling me under. He was slipping away, and I was slipping too, torn between Paris and Atlanta, between the life I'd built and the one they kept dragging me back to. My laptop sat on the desk, the Paris briefing untouched since I'd left the office, a lifeline I couldn't reach for yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolling to Daniel's message, flight set, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Paris teams ready. Call me. I stared at it, my thumb hovering, until the screen dimmed, leaving me with my own reflection, hollow-eyed, frayed at the edges. A knock at the door jolted me upright, sharp and insistent against the quiet. My pulse spiked, irrational images flashing, Margaret, here to deliver another edict, Sophie, fleeing her new throne. I crossed the room, peering through the peephole, and froze. It was Daniel Carter himself, his tie loosened, rain dampening his gray suit, a bottle of bourbon tucked under his arm. His face was drawn, shadows carving deeper lines than I'd seen at the firm. Daniel? I opened the door, stepping back as he brushed past me, the scent of rain and whiskey trailing in his wake. What are you doing here? Couldn't sleep, he said, setting the bottle on the desk with a thud. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual boardroom polish. Heard you were still in town, thought you might need this more than me. He pulled 2 plastic cups from his coat pocket, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Henry's favorite. Figured we owed him a toast. I hesitated, then nodded, sinking into the chair by the window as he poured. The bourbon glinted amber in the dim light, its sharp aroma cutting through the room's stale air. He handed me a cup and raised his own, the plastic crinkling under his grip. To Henry, he said, his tone heavy. The bastard who built it all. To Henry, I echoed, clinking my cup against his. The first sip burned, a slow fire down my throat, grounding me in a way coffee never could. We sat in silence for a moment, the rain tapping a restless rhythm against the glass, the city sprawling beyond like a chessboard I was still learning to play. Got news, Daniel said finally, leaning back against the desk, his eyes fixed on the bourbon swirling in his cup. The Paris deal's holding, barely. Their team spooked, but your briefing kept them in line. And with Henry, he trailed off, jaw tightening. Well, the firm's not letting it die with him. I nodded, relief flickering through me, cautious but real. Good. I'll be there tomorrow, lock it down. That's not all, he said, meeting my gaze now, his expression shifting, something between caution and excitement flickering there. The partners met today. With Henry out, we're restructuring. Merging the Atlanta branch back into the main firm, Sophie's role included. And we want you as a partner, Emily. Full stake. New York, Paris, wherever you want to run it from. The words hit like a shockwave, rippling through me, too big to process at first. Partner. Not just an associate clawing her way up, but a name on the letterhead: Gibson, Carter, and me. My breath caught, a mix of disbelief and hunger surging up, the kind of ambition I'd buried under years of steady, unglamorous work. I set the cup down, the bourbon sloshing slightly, and stared at him. "You're serious," I said, more statement than question, testing the weight of it. "Dead serious," he replied, a faint grin breaking through. "Henry pushed for it months ago, said you were the future. I didn't see it then, not fully. But after this week, the way you held it together, kept Paris alive, faced down your family bullshit, I get it now. You're in, if you want it." If I wanted it. The question hung there, heavy with promise and peril. I stood, crossing to the window, my reflection a ghost against the rain-slicked city. Partner meant power, real power, not just a corner office but a seat at the table, a chance to shape the firm Henry had bled for. But it also meant tethering myself deeper to this world, Sophie's world, Margaret's world, a web I'd spent years trying to escape. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, feeling the pulse of Atlanta beyond, its old money roots and new money dreams colliding in the haze. "I need to think about it," I said finally, turning back to him. My voice was steady, but my mind raced, weighing the cost against the prize. "It's big, Daniel. Bigger than me." "It's not," he said, stepping closer, his tone firm. "It's exactly you. But yeah, think it over. We'll talk in New York, after Paris. No rush." I nodded, the bourbon's warmth settling in my chest, a quiet thrill beneath the caution. He finished his drink, setting the cup beside the bottle, and clapped a hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture from a man who thrived on distance. "Get some sleep, Emily. You've earned it." He left, the door clicking shut behind him, and I stood there, alone again, the room humming with the weight of his offer. Partner. The word danced in my head as I sank back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling's faint cracks. It was what I'd wanted, proof I'd made it, that I wasn't just the family fixer or Henry's protege. But it came with strings, tangled and taut, pulling me back to the people I'd fought to leave behind. Sleep didn't come easy. The rain tapered off, leaving a restless quiet, and I drifted in and out, Daniel's words chasing me through fractured dreams. By morning, the sky was a bruised gray, matching the ache in my bones as I packed for Paris, laptop, files, a blazer of my own. The flight loomed, a battle I was ready to win, but the partnership lingered, a question I couldn't answer yet. 2 weeks later, I stood in Margaret's dining room, the air thick with the scent of roasted lamb and red wine, the chandelier casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany table. The house on Habersham Road felt different now, still imposing, its portraits of stern ancestors glaring down, but softer somehow, the edges smoothed by something I couldn't name. Sophie sat across from me, her blazer swapped for a sweater, the bruise faded to a faint shadow on her arm. Margaret presided at the head, her silk scarf a quiet crown, her posture less rigid than I remembered. Henry's absence ached, a silent guest among us. He'd slipped away 3 days after I'd left for Paris, his fight ending in a sterile room I hadn't been there to see. "To new beginnings," Margaret said, raising her glass, her voice steady but laced with something fragile, grief, maybe, or pride. The crystal clinked as we joined her, Sophie's hand trembling slightly, mine firm despite the storm still simmering inside me. Paris had been a victory, the merger signed, the firm's name intact, Henry's legacy secured. I'd walked those cobblestone streets, fought in those sleek boardrooms, and come home with a win that felt hollow without him. But Sophie, she'd held Atlanta together, clumsy at first, then steady, her grit shining through in ways I hadn't expected. The branch was hers now, folded into the firm, and I'd accepted the partnership the day after his funeral, Daniel's handshake sealing it in a New York office that still smelled of fresh paint. "Emily," Sophie said, her voice cutting through the clatter of silverware, "I couldn't have done it without you. Guiding me, even from Paris. I mean it." I met her gaze, those wide eyes softer now, tempered by something hard-won. "You did it yourself," I said, and I meant it, a truth that settled the last of my resentment into something like peace. "I just yelled at you a lot." She laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that echoed off the high ceilings, and Margaret's lips twitched, a rare crack in her armor. The meal stretched on, stories spilling out, Henry's gruff wisdom, Sophie's first client win, my Paris standoff with a stubborn Frenchman who'd nearly tanked the deal. Laughter mingled with the clink of glasses, a fragile harmony I hadn't thought possible. Later, I stepped onto the back porch, the night air cool against my skin, the lawn stretching dark and quiet under a sky studded with stars. The city hummed in the distance, a low thrum of life beyond the oaks lining the property. My glass of wine rested on the railing, its ruby glow catching the moonlight, and I let my mind drift, to Henry's pride, Sophie's growth, the partnership waiting for me in New York. Closure settled over me, soft and sure, laced with a cautious optimism I hadn't felt in years. Footsteps creaked behind me, and Sophie joined me, her sweater pulled tight against the chill. "It's weird, isn't it?" she said, staring out at the darkness. "Us, here, not fighting." "Yeah," I admitted, a smile tugging at my lips. "Weird, but good." She nodded, her shoulder brushing mine, a quiet solidarity forming in the space between us. Margaret's silhouette moved inside, clearing plates with a grace that hid her own reckoning, her daughter lost, then found, her control relinquished to something bigger. The house stood behind us, a monument to power and pain, but tonight, it felt like a home again. "I'm proud of you too, you know," I said, the words slipping out, unbidden but true. Henry was right. "You've got heart." She turned to me, eyes bright, and for once, there was no plea there, just strength, mirrored back at me. "Thanks, Em. For everything." We stood there, the night wrapping around us, and I felt the last threads of the old war unravel, replaced by a new venture, a family stitched back together, and a future I could finally claim. The stars blinked above, steady and sure, and I raised my glass to them, to Henry, to us.